If your team isn't right now rethinking its AI stack after June, they need to be. Welcome to the / podcast. I'm your host, James Carman, and this is the Hot Fix. A lot has happened over the last few weeks. I got to go on vacation, which was nice, but I come back and the world's all crazy. Let's get started. June 9th, Anthropic launched the most capable AI model ever in the history of ever. 3 days later, the government shuts it down, switched it off worldwide, went through 19 days of darkness, and then had its resurgence. On the day it went dark, a Chinese lab shipped an open weights model that is close enough to the frontier models to actually make a difference, to actually matter. So we're going to cover a few stories, but it's kind of one thread. It's all about like who actually controls the AI that you're building things on and what it costs, depending on someone else's stack to do your work. Okay, first story we want to talk about is Fable. So Fable 5 comes out, but it had a little bit of a false start. Again, on June 9th, Claude launches Fable 5. Again, this is that first model in their Anthropic's Mythos class, is what they kind of call it. We've been hearing about this Mythos stuff for a while, and Glasswing and all of that. Well, we finally got a model from them, and they called it Fable 5. So with this Mythos class model, they added in a bunch of safeguards, or so they thought, right? The idea was you're not allowed to do anything like bioweapons or any sort of AI research, it seemed like. What it would do, it would automatically silently downgrade you to Opus 4.8 if you were doing anything that it didn't like. So it was classifying what you were asking and what you were doing and silently downgrading you to Opus. That's what was going on. That's what they released on June 9th. Amazon, some researchers from Amazon, which this is one of their big partners, so they really had no reason to kind of poo-poo this thing from Anthropic. They had, it was in their best interest for this thing to flourish, but they found a jailbreak where they could bypass all of those safeguards and get it to do things that it was not supposed to be doing. In particular, cybersecurity was a big thing here. The cybersecurity safeguards, so you could use Fable to start to attack other people's networks and those sort of things, right? So they were able to get past those safeguards. They jailbroke it, right? And then they went and told the government and said, hey, we were able to get past this. This needs to be fixed. The government, Commerce Department reached out to them and they said that they couldn't, they didn't think the exploit was a big deal. It already existed. It even existed in OpenAI's models already. Wasn't a big deal. They didn't take it as very seriously, so they weren't going to do anything about it. So the government, they did what they could do, and they used the EAR, Export Administration Regulations. This is the Commerce Department's rules around dual-use technology. These are things that can be commercial and military security application type stuff. Now, this is the interesting part here is that the EAR covers what they call deemed exports. Anytime you share technology with a foreign national inside the U.S., that's legally counting as exporting it to their home country. So someone who's here as a foreign national in the United States, if the technology or whatever you're dealing with is shared with them, that is exactly the same as them taking it back home to their home country. So this order that they sent out prohibited access by any foreign national, whether it's inside the United States or outside the United States. There's no way for Anthropic to figure that out in real time. They didn't have the infrastructure or the features built into their platform to do this. They didn't have what the banking industry calls KYC, know your customer. That wasn't built in. So they just shut it down for everyone globally. On June 30th, those controls were lifted, and July 1st, it got redeployed with new cybersecurity classifier, again, split into Fable 5 for the public folks like us. And there's also Mythos is also out there, but it's only for approved organizations only. This comeback was a little messy, right? When they've redeployed it now, the safeguards are a lot more conservative. Some queries are, they're going to be falling back to Opus again, just like they were before. Also, Bridgebench debugging scores that came out. So they reportedly they dropped from 86.2 on debugging all the way down to 25.9 after the relaunch. There's been a lot of user backlash about the model being caged, or as we say in the gaming industry, it got nerfed, right? These classifiers are another kind of a new tax on capability. This is a new thing that we weren't having to deal with before. You really you don't know. You may not be getting the model that you're paying for, right? You're paying for Fable, and depending on the nature of what you're trying to do, there's no way to use Fable for that work. It will downgrade you to Opus. So this is kind of a new risk that you have, right? And there's well, this is big, right? This whole story is big. The bigger risk that organizations face right now, this is an entirely new category of enterprise risk for, the governments could always get involved in a lot of different industries, but in particular, this is big for a lot more folks, right? Now, the regulatory shutdown. This is the government saying, we don't like what's going on, shut it down. Nobody's available, or no, make this available to no one. There was zero notice. There was no recovery path. This is now sitting alongside outages and deprecation warnings you're going to get from your vendors. And of course, pricing, lock in, and they just raise the prices on you. All of those risks existed before. However, now we have this regulatory risk, regulatory shutdown risk. Now we have to update our governance models, right? So it has to be tiered, authorization-based access with a trusted partner tier. Federal regulators can now influence the frontier model availability. This is structural. This is not a one-off thing. So if your product or delivery pipeline had Fable 5 wired into it, you lost it for 19 days. You went dark. Now, a lot of people didn't have it. It was only out for 3 days. I will say it was, and it's back now, but it was pretty awesome. I did get a chance to play around with Fable when it was out, and it was pretty impressive. But for 19 days, folks were dead in the water. There was a lot of folks like me that jumped on this and started doing work, and we really liked it, and then it was gone. And you're like, okay, what do I do now? Right? That's a problem. All right, story number 2, GLM 5.2. This is the open weight model I talked about in the opening. This hits the market. The release was on June 13th. Interestingly enough, this was the first day of the Fable blackout. I believe the name of the company is Jupu. It's, for us Eastern or Western civilization folks, that's Z.AI. They shipped GLM 5.2. This is a 753 billion parameter sparse mixture of experts model. So this is an interesting thing, this mixture of experts model. It's huge, right? So it's 753 billion parameters, but only roughly 40 billion parameters are going to be active per token. So it's tremendously cutting down on that inference cost, right? 1 million token context, MIT license, and open weights. The performance. It rivals Claude Opus on coding. It tops it on design and visual taste. It tops the leaderboards on that over GPT 5.5. SemGrep found it to beat the safety-restricted Fable 5 on their cyber benchmarks. We now have Mythos at home, is what they said. The cost is roughly 1/6 of the closed U.S. Frontier pricing. It's plug and play, self-hosting. You can actually host this thing on your own. This is being called a mini DeepSeek moment. There's a lot of viral developer interest. We know people have been racking up these token costs with trying to do software engineering. So people are very interested. They're actually running it inside Claude code. So they're using Claude. The API of this thing adheres to the Anthropic API signature or contract. So you can just point Claude code at this thing using environment variables. And now you're using this thing instead, which is much cheaper. The export controls, this is kind of the interesting thing. The export controls meant to contain the risk handed this Chinese company and this open source model a 19-day head start. InfoSec leaders published an open letter saying exactly that. The open weights. So the idea here is when you train these models, all it is a bunch of numbers, right? So and then you feed these tokens through this neural network. But when you're going through training, you're trying to arrive at the best set of numbers that will produce the best results for you. So there's 750 billion of these numbers. But what they do is they publish these weights, these numbers as is. So you can pick up these weights and you can fire them up in a neural network and you can start using them. So that's how this open weight thing works. The killer feature isn't exactly price. Price is cool, right? I mean, it's cheaper. You still would have to run things that cost money. But the big thing is nobody can turn it off if you're running this on your own, right? If you're self-hosting it. This is sovereignty as a product feature. Now, as I said, these weights are just a big stack or set of numbers, right? And they're set up in a structured way so that they can be used in a neural network. The weights themselves ship as what they call safe tensors. So this is not code. This is literally just a bunch of numbers, and they hand these to you and say, good luck, right? You can load them using generic open source harnesses like VLLM or SGLang. Those all have community reviewed code. Those are, I believe those frameworks are even in the United States. There's no Chinese software. However, the official GLM 5.2 recipe. So if you want to run this thing on your own, how they tell you to do it, they turn on this thing. There's a feature when they're loading their models, trust remote code. That allows that flag that you have to turn on to start these things, downloads and executes Jupu's custom Python modeling code from their Hugging Face repo. It's small, it's an auditable surface, but it is vendor code that you run in your environment. This is vendor code coming from China. What I would probably do is wait for a native in-tree VLLM or SGLang support when it's been merged in and reviewed. I would definitely audit the modeling files at a pinned to revision. Want to make sure you're using the exact revision that is vetted. There are third-party vetted repacks of this stuff. NVIDIA ships one. So the idea here is weights are not code. So these open weight models, they're not code. They also aren't neutral either. The behavior is trained into the model, into these weights. There's behavior there. They've taught it to behave a certain way. Anthropic did some research on this, calling it sleeper agents on trigger conditioned behaviors in the model. For a coding model whose output that you use to generate code of your own, and then you go run that code, those weights are sitting upstream from the code that is being generated. So it's a little meta of an attack vector here. What they're doing is building the vulnerability into the models themselves so that when they do generate code, they might generate code that has vulnerabilities in it that can be exploited. So that's the vector you have to worry about, right? No matter how clean your harness is and you make sure, okay, all I'm doing is loading weights, those weights can still have an issue. So you have to still do code review. You got to do sandboxing of whatever the model output, the kind of code that these models are generating. You still need to be careful. Even though it's just open weights, you're just loading up a bunch of numbers and tearing loose with these numbers and letting them do their magic. All right. Segment 3. This or story 3 is about there have been some open source supply chain attacks happening. Supply chain is how maybe it's not attacking the code while it's running, but it's attacking your process that you use to build the code that you're creating. There were a wave of concurrent attacks on open source developers in June. Compromised projects are Aqua Security's Trivy, which is a security scanner. Again, the irony here is just writing itself. Bitwarden and Checkmarks. Downstream compromises hit some of the big names, including OpenAI and Vercel. So this is another piece of that warning of this open source enthusiasm. Everybody's very excited about this open source stuff right now, but self-hosting these open weights gives you sovereignty, but it also now makes you the security team. This open source stuff is not free. You're trading the vendor risk for perhaps a supply chain risk of your own, right? And how you get these things stood up and running correctly, you run the risk of somebody taking advantage of vulnerabilities in that supply chain itself. You need to make sure you're doing dependency scanning. You want to use SBOMs, SBOM, which is a software bill of materials, and inventory of every component in your software. You want to add provenance checks into your software. These are not optional anymore. You have to be doing this stuff. The tools you scan with can themselves be compromised, right? So you have to be very, very careful of these things. What does all this mean? I think these three stories are really kind of one big thread, one big lesson. The model access and the software supply chain itself are dependency risks that you have to architect for, right? I will say the Mythos thing is not an isolated incident. Again, OpenAI launched GPT 5.6 on June 26th. The White House requested initial access be limited to only 20 government-approved organizations. This is the first AI launch under explicit U.S. government coordination. Fable 5, again, this was not a one-off. The Fable 5 thing was not a one-off. Managed access is now going to be the pattern across the two frontier labs. You're going to see this pattern occurring more and more. For engineering leaders, my big thing I would say is you've got to abstract away the model itself. Don't hardwire to a single vendor. Make sure that you can swap these models. And I think this concept has already come up. These things have already started to become more commoditized anyway. The harnesses are now the more important thing. Make sure that you are multi-vendor by default. You're supporting multiple vendors with your design and your architecture. And I would absolutely start evaluating open weights. I would seriously start looking at this. Maybe it's a tiered model where some workloads can use these open weight models, and that's totally fine. Maybe you reserve the frontier models for particularly tricky or things that the open weight models aren't good at yet. That's, you have to play around with it to see, where the sweet spot is there. But I would absolutely start looking into GLM 5.2 in particular and look at self-hosting. This is going to be a real option, especially for regulated industries. And if you have IP sensitive work, you're definitely going to want to look into this. And if you want to protect your supply chain and protect, all of your dependencies, you want to be more sovereign with your stack, right? You want to make sure that you're verifying what model you're actually getting. So these silent fallbacks are problematic, right? The safety routing that's built into these models, this is another thing that can change, right? It's not necessarily the new model comes out. They could tweak the security protocols, that classifier that's saying what is the intent of what you're doing, and then it auto downgrades you to the less capable model. That's another thing that can change, and without really any notice, and without you really knowing much about it, you can actually change behavior in your production environment. I would definitely harden your supply chain. If you go with open, self-hosted, you're going to need SBOMs, dependency scanning, provenance verification. This is the bare minimum. This is table stakes. You've just got to do it. I think managed access is going to become the norm for every frontier model release from here on out, I would guess. we're already seeing it again with OpenAI. Both of them are having this issue. There's talk of regulatory movement here on this, that this is to be treated very seriously when these new models come out, getting the government involved. I'm not happy about it. I'd rather the industry go into more of a self-governance mode. I would rather that be the pattern that we follow. We do this with other things, like the PCI credit card stuff. That's not a government induced thing. That organization is payment card industry does that on their own. They self-impose those restrictions and those patterns. June of 2026 was the month that AI actually became real infrastructure for you. Infrastructure gets regulated, it fails, and it needs redundancy. You need to think of AI in that way. If your team isn't right now rethinking its AI stack after June, they need to be. Again, model abstraction, you've got to have a fallback strategy. You need to be multi-vendor by default. You absolutely should be looking at open weights evaluation. How do I run these things on my own safely with all of the supply chain hardened? That's what you should be investing in right now. Well, that's it for this hot fix. Stay tuned. Next episode, hopefully in a couple of weeks. I was on vacation the last couple of weeks, so I wasn't able to get out an episode. But let me know, what do you think of this format? We're gonna try it out for a little while. I have had some good feedback on this, so let me know what you think. If there's anything you like, you don't like, absolutely get in touch with us. Reach out to us at @Calibrity.com, and we'll see you next time. The / podcast is created by Calibrity. The / team is director and producer Ryan Wilson, editing by Steve Baradelli, marketing support by Taylor Blessing, and I'm your host, James Carman. Thanks for listening.